Hi, good morning. I'm Jim Hodgson. I'm the Executive Director of the Fort Worth Aviation Museum, and I'm also the Chairman of the Board of the OV-10 Bronco Association. And we're here today to talk about the OV-10. The one behind me here is a Marine Corps OV-10. Went into service in 1968 and served in Vietnam. This one also, after the Vietnam War, went to Okinawa, served with VMO-6 in Okinawa, served with VMO-2 in Vietnam. And then later, towards the end of its career, went back to VMO-2 at Camp Pendleton in California about 1990-91, and then went to the Bureau of Land Management, where it was transferred up to Fairbanks, Alaska, and it operated with BLM up there as a lead-in aircraft for firefighters. So we're going to talk a little bit about the airplane here this morning and some of the characteristics of it. I flew the airplane for about 3 years, and so this is the first airplane I flew out of flight school. Some of the first things you're going to see is this little stick out the side, and that's the angle of attack indicator. So from there you get the idea of what the airplane is doing in relationship to the angle of attack on the wind. You're going to notice that the landing gear on this airplane is not common to most airplanes that you see, primarily because it was designed to operate off of unprepared fields. In many cases, even in furrowed fields. It was tested in furrowed fields. So it's kind of a knuckled gear. It's a trailing gear so that it can handle rough surfaces. We've got the cockpit. If you look at it from the front, we're going to show you one of the primary features of the airplane. Is if you look nose on to the airplane, you're going to notice that the canopy is curved, and that was intentional. This airplane was designed from the ground up to be a forward air control airplane, reconnaissance airplane. So the curvature of the canopy allows you to actually see underneath the airplane from the front seat. The high wing was designed so that you would have good visibility all the way around, so there are very few blind spots on this airplane. When you sit in the cockpit, the seat of the airplane is up just about to your hip level, as opposed to when you look at a fighter or some of these other airplanes where the canopy rail is at your shoulders. You're sitting way up high in the cockpit on this one. Okay, a couple things about the nose of the airplane I want to talk about. We've got this on here for protection right now, but this is the pitot tube on the airplane. And oftentimes we'd take them to air shows, and we had a series of questions that we had to answer for people. We'd go, no, it's not a P-38, it's an OV-10 Bronco. No, that's not a machine gun, it's a pitot tube. And yes, this is the airplane that's been flying over your house. Interesting landing light. It's in the nose of the airplane as opposed to in the wing roots like a lot of other airplanes are. We used to fly them in Yuma, Arizona a lot, out of there and working with airplanes on the range. And one of the things that we did on more than one occasion was at night, leaving the ranges, fly down on the railroad tracks until we'd see another train and turn on the landing light, and we'd watch sparks come off the wheel on the trains. We've got a little our ventilation system here. Our total air conditioning system on the Bronco is just like a 53 Buick. You pull the little handle in front, and that would pop up, and you'd get airflow through the airplane. And then we had exhaust ports in the canopy itself. Entry and exit on the airplane. No graceful way to get in and out of an OV-10. You simply climb up and you step on things and you grab and climb until you're in the airplane. Nothing very graceful about it at all. Once you're settled in, it's a reasonably comfortable seat. Although when we would operate in the Southwest, down in Arizona and places like that, or any time in the summertime, we always take 2 or 3 or even 4 canteens with us. No air conditioning. As we were mentioning, it's not an easy task to get in. You just have to grab and climb and then just get up into the cockpit. Once you're there, you're pretty well settled in. Everything is, the airplane is relatively easy to fly because the primary job of the airplane is not flying the airplane, but it's directing aircraft and artillery from outside. So it's a very busy cockpit from that standpoint. We had UHF, VHF, Fox mic radios, and high freq radios. So we could literally talk to almost anybody in the world from the airplane, and we would use that for talking to ground troops, for talking to artillery batteries, talking to mortar platoons, talking to ships when we did naval gunfire exercises, or be talking to airplanes or SATCOM around the world. So there was plenty of opportunities to communicate, and in many situations that we got into, we became an airborne command and control as opposed to doing our actual job of controlling things on the ground. 2 seats in the airplane, one in the front, one in the back, can be flown from either cockpit. The back seat was primarily for an observer. We used our artillery officers a lot. Air Force used interpreters in the back seat in Cambodia, but we would also have any number of other people that would be in the back seat, utilizing the back seat for different purposes. Limited instrumentation in the back. There were throttles. There was a stick. There was no landing gear handle in the back. And to be able to key the radios, somebody would have to have the person in the front seat change the radios. Many of the aerial observers that we flew with carried a long expanding pointer so that they could reach up front and switch the radios around if they had to. Part of that was their own insurance. In the case of an incapacitated pilot, they could still control the radios from the back. On all of the OV-10s, they were built with a Sponson. The Sponson was designed for two purposes. One is it carried two M60 machine guns on board the Sponson, and also underneath were the ordnance racks. So there were two ordnance racks on both of the Sponsons plus a center line. So we had the capability of carrying 5 external stores of various different types. We've got a 100-gallon fuel tank on here right now, but we oftentimes carried a 20mm cannon on the center line of the airplane. Fuel was a big one when we'd go out and be on station for a long time to do forward air control missions. With the external drop tank, we could easily be airborne for 4.5 to 5 hours. So it got to be a long, hot day sometimes. We'll show you on the Air Force model that we've got the rocket pods that we used to carry, the 19-shot rocket pods. But we also carried Zunis. We also carried ADSIDs, which were acoustical sensors that we dropped along the U.S.-Mexico border, and they used in Vietnam. So they look like a cartoon bomb, and when they'd hit the ground, they had like, it looks like branches off the back, so it looked like a shrub without leaves, and that was actually the antenna. So they had acoustical and seismic sensors in there so that they could monitor activity around the area. Two T-76 turboprop engines, 745 shaft horsepower or thereabouts. The airplane used, as I mentioned, the T-76, but it was also a TPE 331, same engine that came out of the Aero Commander and several other airplanes. As we walk along here, it was originally designed with the air scoop down below, but in production models they turned it upside down so that the air scoop was up high, and this was to avoid sucking in debris off of the ground. Airplane was fairly easy to work on. Mechanically, they could just open up the clamshell, and so you had easy access to the engine and most of its component parts. Big fat wing, not necessarily terribly aerodynamic. The airplane wasn't built for speed or comfort, but it was built for observation purposes and being able to stay on station for quite a while. The production airplane had a 40-foot wingspan. The pre-production prototypes were 30-foot wingspan, and what the test pilots told us is that they didn't like the capabilities of the airplane. It was the only airplane that Ed Gillespie said ever scared him, was the 30-foot wingspan airplane. The roll rate was very high. Most of the thrust was actually was being produced off of the props on the engines across the wing, as opposed to just the standard airflow. So for production purposes, they added 5 feet to both sides. Airplane is a full STOL capable airplane. When the flaps were all the way down and you needed to, the airplane you could take the airplane off in about 800 feet, and you could land it and stop it at about 200 feet going into reverse thrust. So highly capable of getting into confined areas in and out, but as the NATOPS manual said, full STOL operations of the airplane should only be considered when the welfare of the crew is not at stake. So that was always interesting. You can't really see it, but up on the top of the wing are slots, and there were little spoilers that would pop up, and this was part of the active flight control system. It was incorporated with the ailerons. So you would, when you'd exercise the ailerons on the opposite wing, you would get these spoilers that would come up that would kill the lift, so that the airplane had very good maneuvering capabilities. In fact, at max knots, which was about 350 knots in a dive on a good day, the minimum turn radius was 500 feet. and that was partly because of the spoiler system on the wings. The nacelles on the wings on the airplane are identical, left to right. It was done for a number of reasons. One was commonality, another one was so that they were somewhat interchangeable. And inside in the landing gear area, still pretty much the same. Again, you notice it's got the knuckled landing gear with a big balloon tire for unprepared strips. The hole up in the front right there was where the battery for the airplane would go. Excuse me, the airplane was designed so that it was highly utilitarian from the standpoint that it could utilize a number of different fuel mixtures. It could use standard gasoline if need be, and all you had to do was change the specific fuel setting on the engine to go from JP to go to avgas to go to truck gas. Now that wasn't something that you'd want to do on a regular basis, but it was you had the capability of doing that. Starting the airplane was also fairly simple, especially if you had two airplanes with you. Because if you were in a situation where the battery was dead, you could take the battery off another airplane, stick it up in the airplane here, start it up, then remove the battery, put it back in the other one. There was also another way to do that, and that's back here in the cargo compartment, right next to the cargo compartment. This is the auxiliary power supply. You'll see utility power and starting power. So you had the capabilities here of using a start cart and plug it into the airplane to be able to start the airplane. You also had the capability, if you took a cable like this with you and you had two airplanes on the road, you could start one airplane up and use the cable out power from one airplane in power to the other one and start it that way. And then the last way to get the airplane started was to do an on-the-ground air start. You could go to the prop, take the spinner off the prop, unlock the blades, put the other airplane in front of it, and do an air start on the ground. So one of the secrets of the OV-10 is the cargo compartment. So the airplane was designed so that it could carry 3,200 pounds of whatever you could fit in the cargo compartment, and it wouldn't change the CG of the airplane by more than ½ inch. So the airplane was designed by a couple of Marine majors so that it was to live with the troops and to live with a company, or at least with a regiment. The high tail was for a number of different reasons. Number one was so that a 6x could back up underneath the airplane, and the bed of the 6x would be even with the bed of the OV-10, so that you could transfer items back and forth. You could carry 2 stretchers in here with a corpsman. Or you could carry 4 jumpers. It had lights here in the compartment, jump lights that the pilot would be able to signal people when it was time to get out. What we found in the early 70s, when we started doing that with recon Marines at Camp Pendleton, is that most of them didn't want to get out when you told them to get out on a level drop. We rarely carried a drop tank. If we did, we'd take the tail off of it so that the last man out here, the door would be off, the last man out would sit here with his feet dangling out the back. If the first guy out didn't see the target underneath his feet, they wouldn't necessarily get out. So we had to devise a way to get the people out when they needed to get out, and that was simply to zoom climb, and they would come right out. Now you'll notice nobody's going to stand in here. They would sit in here toboggan style. So no seat belts or anything in the back, and so when it was time to go, you just zoom climb it up and everybody just came right out. So, and also that gave them the room here so that they wouldn't be hit by the tail of the airplane. So these things have been used for a lot of different things, carrying things. I did one operation at China Lake where we had an infrared mapping system that was in the back of the airplane, and we flew over the Owens Valley, and they did recordings of what was on the ground. We were doing it in conjunction with some other things to see the capabilities of some of the photography at the time and the IR photography. So we knew that there were people on the ground in the fields identifying what was actually in the fields, and then we were flying along at about 5,000 to 8,000 feet with this, and then there was an RF-8 or an RF-4 overhead taking pictures, and then there was an SR-71 above that and a satellite, and I always wanted that picture of all of those things all lined up underneath the airplane. So this side of the airplane, essentially identical. We do have antennas up on the top of the nacelles. We've got a variety of antennas, as we mentioned. We've got a variety of different radios that we carry on the airplanes. Again, this side is identical to the other side. And you can see the battery compartment in this one. It's closed up. We don't have any battery in it, but that's where the battery of the airplane would go. So again, this side of the airplane, pretty much like on the other side, no real differences. The stacks would come out of this side, and this airplane was susceptible to SAM missiles. A number of them that were shot down in Vietnam. Essentially because of this, they were redesigned a little bit without a model change for the Desert Storm era. But still, there was a lot of hot gas coming out of here, and it was not uncommon for SAMs to come up and actually come up through the wheel well and take out an engine on one side of the airplane. The D model, this is an A model airplane. The D model is essentially the same. There was very little done to it other than to extend the nose and do some electronic things in it to put the forward-looking infrared radar on it, and to put what we refer to as the disco light up on the top, which was the mirrored device that spun around to try to defeat other IR sources and things like that, and laser guiding. Again, you can see the width of the wing and how fat it is. So not terribly aerodynamic, but very effective. Single engine characteristics with the airplane. There was counter-rotating props. Single engine characteristics with the airplane. It was fairly easy to fly. It was not a big deal to fly it or land it or any of those things. The bigger situation though was on the ground at takeoff. Losing an engine on takeoff was very pricey, or a very iffy situation. You had to get through a transition on the ground of between about, I believe it was 90 knots to 110 knots, because if you lost an engine anywhere in that position, the airplane's roll capabilities would roll the airplane over real fast. It had a 0-0 seat, but it was only 0-0 as long as the airplane was on the ground. If the nose wheel or any of the mains dropped off of the runway, you were outside the envelope. Now, something didn't mention on the ejection system on this airplane is that the canopy did not leave the airplane in an ejection. Yeah, let's walk up to the canopy and we'll take a look. You'll notice it's not a single piece canopy. It's made in sections. The forward and the aft section, and a rear section, and a piece on the top. If you look up closely on the top of the seat, you'll notice that on the top of the seat on each end, we call them horns that are sticking up. So if you ejected from this airplane, the rear went first and then the front seat went, but you actually went up through the canopy. So there's things on the top of the seats were canopy breakers. So you'd pull the handle and you'd go right up through the canopy itself. The parachutes were not attached to the pilots and the observer, they were attached to the seat. You buckled them into you, but you didn't have the pack on your back. It was actually on the back of the seat, and they were offset, so they were on the different sides of the seat, so that as you'd come out of the airplane, the weight of the parachute would separate you laterally as you'd come out. Airspeed takeoff airspeed was normally about 110 knots. That was where we would, you could take off a lot lower than that, but you were risking the proposition of a loss of an engine and having an excessive roll rate with the landing gear still down and just transitioning to flight. So most of the times from an operational standpoint, we stayed on the ground until we transitioned through that and rotated and took off at about 110 knots. Normal cruise is about 230, 235, up to 250. And then in maintenance test flights and things like that, we would get up to 350 knots with the airplane.
How many hours, roughly how many hours do you have in the aircraft?
I've got just over 500 hours in these. I flew the airplane for not quite 3 years. And so this was my initial airplane out of flight school. At that point in time, this airplane was considered second tour for helicopter pilots or first tour for jet pilots. So and on the Air Force model, we'll go over and show you. We'll show you the rocket pods over there. Now this is the Air Force OV-10A. We showed you the Marine version. This one's actually about two weeks younger than the Marine version. It was built in Columbus, Ohio, like all of the OV-10s. It left, it went overseas, it went to Thailand, to NKP. It spent the entire war there. Then it came back to the States, and it went to Shaw Air Force Base. From Shaw, it went to Europe, to Germany, to Sembach, Germany, and it was translanded and flown over and flown back. After it got back, It was transferred out to Tucson, or to George Air Force Base, I think it was. And then from George, it went to Osan, Korea, and then came back and then went to Tucson. At that point in time, about 1990 or so, it was decommissioned from the military, and it went to the Bureau of Land Management, and it went to Fairbanks, Alaska, where both of these airplanes operated for a number of years. When the Bureau of Land Management shut down its OV-10 program, the airplanes went to Cal Fire in Sacramento. And that's at the point where we acquired both of the airplanes, was through Cal Fire, when they decided they no longer needed them. So if you look at the rocket pods on these on this airplane, this is a 19-shot rocket pod, and you'll notice it's got 2 rockets in it. They're 2.75-inch rockets. They're unguided, and the blue one means that it's inert. The other one is painted up as what would normally look like as a Willie Pete rocket head, which means that it had white phosphorus in it, so when it hit the ground, you'd get a large puff of white smoke, and that's how you controlled airplanes and directed airplanes onto a target. You would get them to identify your smoke, and then you'd tell them where the target was from the smoke, and you would tell them, 3 o'clock, 100 feet or 100 meters or whatever, and then you tell them to go ahead and they would be cleared hot when you felt that the area was clear and they had the target in sight, and you'd given them the instructions for how you wanted them to run in and then leave the target and then come back around for another pass. If you did it perfectly, you'd tell people to hit your smoke, and that was always the call that you wanted to do, is have your smoke right on the target so that they didn't have to adjust at all. The larger rocket is a representation of an HE high explosive round. This airplane, you'll notice it's got 2 of the rocket pods on it, 2 of the 19-shot rocket pods. I've flown these with as many as 4 of these on, and a centerline drop tank, so you'd be out all day doing this kind of stuff, and it got to be very tiring at the end of the day, being in an all-glass cockpit like this all day long, making single passes, 1 rocket at a time, single passes, because you're controlling different flights of air on target. So this airplane is, for all intents and purposes, it's identical to the Marine Corps version. I was just looking to see that the Air Force sometimes on theirs had a high freak radio antenna. We called it a towel rack antenna that you'll see on some airplanes. We don't have that on this one. So other than that, essentially the same airplanes. The Air Force often flew single pilot with these airplanes, but the Marine Corps rarely ever did. If we did, it was a maintenance test flight or something like that. We always flew with an observer in the back seat or another pilot in the back seat. All the pilots in the back seat could do all of the same types of things that the artillery officers could do. Air Force, as I mentioned, oftentimes flew by themselves. They also flew this airplane as a nail fac, which underneath the airplane they had a device that looked like a long cylindrical tube, and it was a laser designating pod, and they could designate with that and then control other airplanes with laser guided bombs that could drop their bombs on target. They did those over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That was some of the early uses of laser guided bombs was there. So they had an operator in the back who was essentially a systems operator who was operating the laser spot. And when they flew in Cambodia, they would have translators in the back seat. The Cambodians spoke French as well as Cambodian, so the Air Force had to go out and find people that they could put in the back seat of the OV-10 who could be translators for them. And so in some cases they went out and got people, and we know stories of somebody who was a baker one day, and 2 weeks later rather, he's in the back seat of an OV-10 helping control airstrikes in Cambodia. So that's kind of the story of the OV-10. It's over 50 years old now. There were 2 that just within the last year were over in Iraq and being used against ISIS. It's a solid platform. It needs some updating from the standpoint of electronics and navigation and those types of things, but still the Navy in its program, or SOCOM in its program, which is called Combat Dragon 2, still with those airplanes, they tested the AT-6 Texan, they tested the Tucano, and they tested the OV-10, and they found that the OV-10, even as a 50-year-old airframe, was superior to the 2 others, maybe not in performance, but in visibility. And so that's the primary benefit that this airplane has always had: great visibility and the ability to be able to go out and see. So that's kind of where we are. So we actually have 3 OV-10s here. We have these 2 that we've just talked about. We've also got the original factory mock-up here, and that's probably one of the rarest pieces we have here at the museum, because it was the design that was built prior to production of the airplane. So at any rate, we encourage everybody to come on out. We have the Bronco Ready Room here, and we have much history about the OV-10 Bronco here at the museum. So there was a gun sight that would have been in the middle. We've got a gun sight inside, but we don't have one here. There's one in the mock-up. But it was very much Kentucky windage. There was no lead computing gun sight or anything like that at all. But here, let me close this up so you can look down over the side and see how much you can see over the side of the airplane.
That's really cool.
Yeah. And you can see your hips are right up here, as opposed to like an F4 where the canopy around beneath the shoulders. We used a lot of grease paint on the windows too. Go out, come out the same way you went in, backwards. Come out backwards.
I don't know if I can do that.
Well, backwards, okay, you can do it that way, but it's going to be a bit of a chore.
Really?
Now, left leg, keep your left leg and go straight down to, it's a long step. There you go.
That's a reach.
Yeah, it is. And it's rowing.